Hello, friends. I am Devon Harris, three-time Olympian, founding member of the Jamaican bobsled team, motivational speaker and author. And I'm really excited to be in conversation with Diana McCaulay, put on by the Jamaican Cultural Alliance for Black History Month. Diana, I'm really excited to spend some time with you. For those of you who don't know her, she is a Jamaican writer and an environmental activist with a really impressive resume. And what I'll do is I'll give you the bullet points, man, because if we spend if I go through her entire resume, I would spend all evening talking about her. She is a founding member, director and retired chief executive officer of the Jamaican Environment Trust, one of Jamaica's leading environmental non-for-profit organizations. She has a bachelor's degree in management studies from the University of the West Indies and a master's in public administration from the University of Washington in Seattle. She was a USA Hubert Humphrey Fellow in 2000 and also earned a graduate certificate in international development policy and management from the University of Washington. She has worked for over 10 years in the insurance industry before she decided that she would leave private sector for public service. I mentioned that she's a writer. She has written 3 critically acclaimed novels, Dog Heart, Hurricane, and Gone to Drift, as well as a self-published White Liver Gal. Her most recent novel, Daylight Come, was released by People Tree Press in September 2020. Her short work, her short fiction has been published in numerous publications and journals and magazines. And in 2012, Diana won the Commonwealth Short Story Prize for her story, The Dolphin Catchers. She is in the process of seeking publication for her first nonfiction work on her environmental journey entitled That Woman. Many of you may remember her, though, as a popular newspaper columnist for the Gleaner between 1994 and 2001. She has received many awards for her environmental work, including a Bronze Musgrave Medal from the Institute of Jamaica, a Ripple Award from the Jamaican Institute of Environmental Professionals, and the Order of Distinction, Officer Class, from the Government of Jamaica on Heroes Day in 2016. She's married to Dr. Frederick Hanley, and she has 1 son. Diana, I am looking forward to chatting again. Welcome to Conversations with none other but you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really privileged to be here.
Yeah, so, as I said, a really impressive resume there. But before we delve into all the work that you have been doing, I'm always curious about the beginnings, the early days of Diana McCaulay. Can you take us back to, where you grew up and what life was like?
So I was born in Kingston, Nuttall Hospital. Spent my whole life here except for my 2 years at college in the US. And I was a real tomboy growing up. And, I guess somewhat different from somebody of my background. I roamed Kingston, first of all, on a bicycle and then on foot later. And I guess I developed just a very strong, love for being outdoors. I have 2 sisters, and my sisters thought, they tell me all the time now I was just too unbearably sweaty. So that's kind of how I grew up. I went to St. Andrew High School. My parents, I was privileged in many ways, but one of them was my parents were also outdoors people. So as kids, we were taken on hikes and picnics and boat trips. And I sort of attribute that to my love of nature, which has stayed with me my entire life. Yeah, so yeah, Kingston grew.
Yeah, you mentioned someone of your background. When in Kingston did you grow up?
So actually, the first house I went to, which is on Sandhurst Crescent, is not even 3 minutes away from where I live now. And I like to say that if you drew a circle around all the places I've lived in Jamaica, it wouldn't take you 5 minutes to cross them in a car. So I live very close to Barbican, basically. And most of my young life was spent on Ligonier Avenue, which is close to Matilda's Corner.
Yeah, indeed. So St. Hugh's High School, what kind of student was that Diana McCaulay in your
No, St.
recollection?
Andrew.
St. Andrews. Ooh,
No. You know, I was lazy, to tell you the honest truth. I mean, I always loved literature and language, and I was a reader from very young. From my mother said I could read at 3. So I've always had a refuge in books, a sanctuary in books. But at school, I was lazy. I did a minimum that could get me through my exams, which I sort of managed, and have a real mathematical blind spot. So the fact that I managed to pass maths at what was then O-levels is a miracle. And it was only after sort of halfway, sort of when I first started to work, and I left school young. I was one of those people who was just on the cusp of when they changed from the 11 plus to common entrance. So I was throughout my school life a year younger than most of my classmates. And so I was young when I left school. And my parents thought I was too young to go away for anything. And so I started work young. And it was only closer to when I was almost 30 that I had a boss who told me that I needed to further my education and really have a bit more ambition for myself.
So speaking of ambition, because I like to talk to people about dreams and what their dreams are, must be the motivational speaker in me. So what did you aspire to do or become when you were younger, riding around Kingston or walking, exploring the place on foot and hanging out at St. Andrews?
So my first ambition was to be a writer, and I started writing at 13. But my dad, who was a real formative influence on me, but he was a very practical person, and he said flatly, you can't earn a living writing. And he was a bit old school, a bit, I suppose we'd say sexist now, where he said, women can't write great literature because women don't go to war, and that's really the only thing we're writing about. And I remember some of my stories about, very, very sort of phases in a woman's life, motherhood, marriage, that kind of thing. And he was absolutely bored by all of that. And he said, no, you have to go and get a skill. And he more or less forced me, in the way that parents could in those days, to go and do a secretarial degree, which I just never imagined for myself that I'd be sitting behind a desk, But I will say that learning to type really stood me in good stead, not just for writing, but for my eventual private sector career. So that was my earliest ambition. I had no thought of the environment. I mean, that wasn't even a thing when I was going to school. So those concerns came along much later in my life. And in secret then, since he seemed to slam that door. So I have a pile of unpublished things scribbled down on paper that I have written all my life.
What drew you to writing, Diana?
It's basically how I make sense of the world. I almost don't know what I think until I have tried to write it down. It's catharsis. It's a way, if something is bothering me, I can get it out. And I also just love the language, the rhythm, the sound, the meanings of words. I love playing with them. I love how they can communicate with people. One of the things that's amazing about writing books, if you eventually do get them published, which did happen to me much later in life, is that you're communicating with people you don't know, may never ever speak to, but there's this set of people outside that you have somehow connected with. Now, they may dislike your book or they may like it, but they've still had this connection with you. And I think that is one of the most miraculous things about writing and language.
Who would you say were your early influences in literature and that you like reading?
So somebody my age would be handed lots of European fiction, and that's mostly what I cut my teeth on. And in fact, most of the early books I read were given to me by my father. So there were a whole lot of war books and seagoing adventures, and I still love that kind of fiction. But as a teenager, I first read Olive Senior, her book Summer Lightning, which is a collection of short stories. And that was the first time I read Caribbean fiction, where the place that I lived appeared in the pages. And that was and Olive, I think, made me think that I could write about the place in which I lived. And then after that, to the Naipaul, we had to do a house for Mr. Biswas for A-levels. He had a bit of an opposite effect because I thought, I'll never write this well. as he did. And so he made me think, this is not something you can aspire to, but Olive made me feel it was possible.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of writing, those were my earliest influences.
So you obviously went into the private sector. You worked as a secretary initially?
Yeah, my first job was a secretary. Actually, my first job was teaching swimming, because I have a little bit of an entrepreneurial streak. It's not great, but I was the kind of kid that would, think of selling the cookies at school or whatever. So I had a little bit of an entrepreneurial streak and decided to teach swimming to adults in the summer holidays at one point. But my first real job where I had a paycheck was at a travel agency on Harbour Street, where I was a secretary and sometime telephone operator.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just very entry level, with the only qualifications behind me besides high school was this secretarial course that my dad insisted I take.
Yeah. So where did you go professionally from there?
So I had a series of jobs like that, and then I had this boss who, and so I really say that one of the things I think young people need is someone outside their immediate family who has faith in them, and makes them think they can do more than they're doing. So I had this boss who said, look, you need to go back to school and get a degree. You're wasted as a secretary. And that was my last secretarial job at an insurance company. And then so I did. I went to do a management degree at night at UA while working full time. And then he kind of inveigled me into doing an insurance degree, because believe me, no one wakes up, no one has that ambition. I want to be an insurance executive. It's something that kind of just happens to you, and just kind of happened to me. And so he pushed me to do that as well. So in the same roughly 4 years, maybe 5 years, I did the chartered insurance qualification, which was something out of the UK, and completed my management degree at UA. And then after that, I was promoted through the ranks in the insurance industry.
Right. So did you, to be clear, I'm not sure, did you start out as an insurance salesperson then, or were you always on the administrative side?
No, my first job in insurance was being a secretary. And I had a marketing job at one point. So after I completed my degree, my first job was marketing, which I was absolutely hopeless. And then more into general management. So the kinds of people who, draft the policies, because by then I had a technical insurance qualification. So draft the policies, sign the policies, negotiate claims, that kind of. Very shortly after I was promoted to my first senior management job, Hurricane Gilbert hit Jamaica. So that was kind of my trial by fire, because I had just taken over the management reins of a small insurance company here and had to deal with a wind catastrophe. So that was quite a testing ground.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that. I obviously remember Gilbert vividly. I was still in the JDF then, and ended up out in Eastern end of Island, St. Thomas and so on, and seeing the devastation, man. And it was, jarring to say the least. What is an insurance executive life like from your perspective, dealing with such a travesty?
It was very difficult. It was very difficult because, you have all the problems of the rest of the country, in the sense that there's no power, communications are down, the streets for a while are blocked. People who have lost their roofs can't reach you so well. There are not enough people to fix the damage. There's the airport was closed for a while, so things couldn't come in. Even things like tarpaulin to keep off the rain was hard for people. And of course, you have thousands of claims that all happen at the same time. So it's a real challenge. And I remember working till 11 o'clock at night. It was only really after it was night, when the people would stop coming to the office, that you could really sit down and try and get files made up and begin the process of claim settlement. So I will never forget the 3 months after Hurricane Gilbert.
Yeah. Were you writing during all of this time, when you were at UA and pursuing your technical qualifications for insurance? Were you writing during those times?
I've written all my life. Sometimes I don't finish. So it's pretty easy for me to sit down and dash off something that just comes into my head. And, it's something. I don't even call it what it is, whether it's a story or whatever. And I would write these things down. It's what's gotten me through difficult times as well. But then I never tried to publish them. I just put them in a box where they stayed to this very day.
So are you saying that there are some masterpieces covered in dust, Diana?
No, in fact, recently I took them out and thought maybe I should digitize them. That would at least be a first step. And when I read them, it's just appalled. They're really, really bad.
Well, it's the first draft. You can't be so hard on yourself, should you?
Yeah, but it was I guess I was practicing my writing muscles. I mean, you're an athlete. The first time you jumped on a cart to practice for a bobsled, you were probably pretty hopeless too, you know. So it's something like that.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't describe it as hopeless, more like scared to death, but that's another story. So is that the advice you'd have for young aspiring writers who may think that their work isn't very good? I mean, today you're an acclaimed writer, that they should just write. It's the early work is basically practice.
I think the best advice any writer can get is that they must write and they must read widely. I had a in teaching creative writing up at UA much more recently, and some of my students didn't read. And I don't think you can be a good writer if you don't read, because you have to have a love and appreciation for the use of language. But I also think people are not the best judges of their own writing. So if I could start over, I would have a small, not a large group, but a small group of people who I could share my work with and who would respond in a critical but positive way. So I think that's another important thing for a young writer to do. And submit. Don't be like me, where you just hold on to it, because although you will have to face rejection, and it's part of every writer's life, no matter how successful you become, you still get rejected. Every rejection teaches you something. So write your work, read your work, get someone else to read it for you, and then send it out.
You said something important there. Read your work. You know, I remember being in high school, and teachers would always say, "Hey, you have to reread your essay, read and reread your essay every time you write it." I never did. I was like, "Why would I need to? I just wrote it." and now I see the wisdom in their advice and training. But you know, you said something important, which I like to end this segment on, the fact that the rejection is a part of life. Whether you're a writer or you know, aspiring to pursue some other goal, professional path, all of us are going to have to deal with rejection. And I'm sure you have dealt with rejection in other areas of your life. I'm going to touch on that in the upcoming segments of this conversation. We are speaking with Diana McCaulay, Jamaican writer and environmentalist. We'll be right back.
Jamaica. You may have heard it referred to as the gem of the Caribbean, or simply put, land of wood and water. But certainly beautiful, adventurous, vibrant, spiritually awakening, charismatic, and many other words have been used to describe what is certainly a place like no other. We could go on and on, because the reality is that the essence and experience that we, the people of Jamaica, love and cherish about our country is more like magic.
Viva el Caribe, 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 viva el Caribe. Abawi di Cancun, nu apa festival, yundu di Cartagena, nu apa festival. Ayang hame ibuna, ama Jamaican, los Dominicanos.
Yes, friends, welcome back to a conversation with Diana McCaulay. Of course, I am your host, Devon Harris, and we are, of course, supported by the Jamaica Cultural Alliance. Diana, when we were speaking earlier, I mentioned that you're the founding member and director, a retired chief executive officer of the Jamaica Environmental Trust. And you, I did not mention earlier, have actually contributed to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. So another feather in your cap, so to speak. Awesome work. But over the last 30 years, Diana, you have led a wide range of efforts to educate Jamaicans on the importance of the natural environment, as well as organizing campaigns to protect the island's special places and filing ground-breaking legal action to build environmental jurisprudence in Jamaica. I'm curious, and I'm sure our audience is as well. Tell us how that work in and on the environment began for you.
It was a visit to a beach. So I told you I had this very fortunate childhood where my parents took me into nature, and I really loved it. And I just started to become aware that places I had known and loved as a child were being degraded. You know, trees were being cut down, there was garbage on the beaches, and I didn't know anything about the environment. And then I saw a man called Dr. Umair Silva, who he was not Jamaican, he was from Mexico. And he started talking about the environment in the newspapers. Now, at the time, there was nobody talking about the environment then. And so I phoned him up and asked him if I could come and talk to him. He was a public health person, so he was mostly dealing with sewage plants that didn't work and the garbage dumps. So I like to call those a glamour part of the work that I did. And I asked him to take me in the fields the next time he was going. And I expected him to forget, but he didn't. And he phoned me up one day and I took a day's leave from my job. And he took me to the places that I, as a lifelong Kingstonian, had never been. The Harborview sewage treatment plant, the two other sewage treatment plants for Kingston, Greenwich and Western, and the Riverton city dump. And I was really appalled, and I remember standing on the beach at Harborview where the partially treated and untreated sewage just flowed across the beach into the sea. And it's right next to a school and a church and the community of Harborview. And I remember thinking, in what universe is this okay? And so that was the beginning for me. Just seeing Riverton was another really eye-opening thing. At that point, I hadn't thought about what happened to the garbage that I put at my gate. Certainly never thought about what happened to the toilet when I flushed it. And to see that pile of waste, and at the time, tons and tons of children combing through it, was a shock. And I just thought, no, somebody needs to do something about these things. We can't have sewage plants that don't work and children rummaging through garbage. So that was the beginning. I took pictures that day. This is back in the day, when you didn't have a cell phone camera, talking about slides and that kind of thing, and projectors. And I invited my friends and business colleagues to come and see them. And out of that meeting, we formed the Jamaica Environment Trust. And then I embarked on a reading program, it's where reading stands me in good stead, and read everything I could about the environment, and eventually left my job to become JET's full-time CEO in 1998.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that you are in the process of seeking a publication for a book about your journey with your work in the environment, entitled That Woman. And I just get the sixth sense that it has to do with the struggles that you have experienced, along that journey. So what really inspired that title, and tell us about some of those struggles?
Well, that's often what I was called, that woman, this woman. I was painted with a lot of different brushes. One of them being is sort of elitist, uptown, not in touch with sort of the real people in Jamaica, being anti-development, anti-job, those kinds of labels. So it's certainly the early days of JETS, where there was very few people who were advocating for things that were framed as, oh, she only cares about crocodiles, she only cares about ferns, doesn't care about people. That's how it was framed. It was unusual. And so there was a fair amount of criticism and even sometimes attack. And often I was just called That Woman. So I thought it was a perfect title, because I guess in a way I was that woman.
Is it that you are speaking to, I guess, on both, I'm going to say both sides of the divide, those who are underprivileged and those who are benefiting from, dare I say, the raping of the environment. Those who are benefiting from the raping of the environment don't want anyone to challenge the status quo. And those who are on the other side of the divide don't understand how the raping of the environment is impacting them and keeping them in poverty.
Right. So I'm never really speaking to somebody who is on the margins of survival when I talk about the environment, because I understand very clearly if you are not sure where your next meal is going to come from, you can't really turn your mind to these type of things. And the environmental movement all over the world is very largely a middle class movement. But what the movement understands is that the impacts of poor environmental management fall most heavily on the poor. So it would very greatly depend on the issue. So for instance, over the years, I had a lot of dealings with fishermen who were displaced from their beaches for hotels. You know, that's the kind of thing. So they understood, fishermen understood that their own livelihoods were being suffered by this so-called development. If you were talking though about people who wanted to buy housing, and the housing was being developed in an area that we thought would later flood, and they were much less sympathetic to arguments about flooding. So it kind of depended on the audience as to what kind of reaction you got. But it's easy for somebody like me to be framed as elitist and out of touch, and that certainly was done for most of my career. Now I've kind of moved into this arena of being kind of an elder and more respectful, but in the earlier days, there was a lot of criticism. I really needed a strong spine at many different times over the 30 years I led it.
Yeah, I heard you tell a story about I guess it was your first trip to Riverton City, and just overcome by the stench, but watching people rummaging through the garbage, and there was this young boy who was wading through the murky waters of the Duane River, and he waved at you and you snapped a picture. And it kind of hit me, because that boy could have been me. For a while, I grew up and lived most of my life in Olympic Gardens, Waterhouse. But for a while, my family lived in Riverton City as well. What is it that people who are at the margins of society not getting about the dangers of not taking care of the environment?
I think they mostly don't feel they have a choice. I mean, again, I've worked and spoken with many people at Riverton over the years, and there are those that live on the Dome, those that live very close to the Dome. And then there are middle class and working class communities nearby, whose children have asthma from the burning and that kind of thing. So again, it's not a single audience, but the ones who are the waste pickers on the Dome, this is how they make their living. They have poor educational backgrounds. They genuinely feel they don't have a choice. And they will often articulate the fact that they are strong enough to withstand the conditions on the dump. And it's all you weak kind of uptown people that can't manage it. We're fine. That's the kind of thing that they will tell you. So, but it's very difficult at whatever level in the society, if someone is earning a living from whatever it is, from waste picking on the dump right up to bauxite mining, if someone is earning a living from what they're doing, it's very hard to convince them that what they're doing is harmful.
So there is obviously, a benefit to even people who are living on the margins to creating harm to the environment. But, we spoke earlier about the fact that you pioneered the writing of environmental laws in Jamaica. I don't think most people, when they think of the environment, though, Diana, also see it as a social justice issue. Can you speak to that?
Sure. No, I didn't pioneer in the writing of laws. I'm not an attorney. I like to say the law is a very powerful tool, but only if you pick it up and use it. So while I was at JET, we picked it up and used it, which is to say we filed lawsuits and filed administrative actions and that kind of thing, but I wasn't involved at all in the writing of laws. Yes, I feel very strongly that environmental issues are social justice issues, and Riverton is a good example of that, right? Because this very large and unmanaged, to a very great degree, dump would not exist in uptown Kingston. It wouldn't be contemplated. And it is that places that have high impacts on public health and quality of life are often sited in locations where more vulnerable people live, people with less power. And so it's a justice issue for me. And, now the question of bauxite mining in copper country is a very topical subject. And the rhetoric is the country benefits from bauxite mining. And there's a sacrifice that is being made, but that sacrifice is not spread equally across the society. And the people who are making a decision to go ahead with bauxite mining in these small rural communities don't live there and don't have to endure the problems that the people in those areas have to live with. And I've always found it impossible to explain to those people why they are the ones that are being sacrificed. So that's why for me it is a social justice issue, because the benefits of whatever development is being done are not shared equally, and the costs are not shared equally. So benefits accrue in one place and the costs are paid in another place.
Yeah, I agree with you, but it also seems to me that not only are the benefits not being shared equally and the costs are not being calculated accurately in the short term, but I think that the long-term trade-off is also devastating, right? You destroy the natural habitat and environment, and then, yeah, initially, those who live on the margins are impacted the most earliest. Those who are more privileged have feel some impact, but then they are able to mitigate it with their wealth, right?
Right, and what you raise about the long and the short term. So we are sacrificing our children's lifestyles for our benefit now. So that's another sort of climate justice issue, where the childhood I had, where there's all kinds of things in Kingston that were just delightful for a young person of any class or background and freely available to everybody, are not going to be available for, my grandchildren. I have 2 grandnephews now, and I know they will not have the childhood I had here, no matter how much they might have. Those things will just not be available to them. So that too, for me, is a justice issue that this generation, my generation, I think, not so much people that are, say, 30 now, but my generation has taken more than our fair share of the Earth's resources, to the point where it's becoming uncertain as to whether the Earth can really support our civilizations at their current level.
Yeah, you brought up the cockpit country, and I want to touch on that subject in a minute, but you also mentioned bauxite, and whether it's bauxite or some other entrepreneurial endeavor, let's call it that, you're going to have people from all walks of society who fall on one or on both sides of the argument. We should have this new development or we shouldn't. So for those people in these rural communities who are relying on bauxite and they see that as a chance to have a good life and raise a family, even though we may destroy the environment, what would be your advice to them?
Well, that too is one of the very real difficulties that you have. We have this idea, we talk about communities as if they are homogeneous communities, and they're not. And so when you go into a community that is close to a bauxite plant, you've got all kinds of people in the audience. You've got people who actually work at the plant and definitely don't want it closed. You have people who have relatives who work at the plant and definitely don't want it closed. Some of those same people have children who are ill because of the operation of the plant, and they don't like that either. And then there's some people who are not working at the plant, but for instance, they might have a cook shop, or they might be running taxis, and the economic activities that the plant generates are what pays their bills. And then you have people who only receive the bad parts. So they neither work for the plant, nor do they have these other activities, and they have to deal with the noise and the sort of public health problems. If they're in farming, they've had their livelihoods, in some cases destroyed by bauxite, or they've been completely displaced. You have another set of people who have been moved from their homes to other parts of the island. So it's a mistake, and it's a mistake I made and had to learn from, to go into a community and think of it as one solid set of people. So the most you can hope for with the people who are actually working in the community is appeal to their sense of fairness and their concern for others, which is sometimes their own children. And so where they tend to stand is the bauxite plant must stay, or the bauxite mining opportunity must stay, but it must improve. It must not cause those kinds of harm. That tends to be their position. And one of the things that I tried to do over the years was to empower the people in the communities on whatever side of the fence they stood, to know what their legal rights were, to know, for example, what the permits that had been granted to whatever company it was said, so that they would be in a position to say, no, we're not supposed to be working after 6:30. This is what the permit says, you must stop work at 6:30. And in that way, to improve qualities of lives and outcomes in a more incremental way. So those are some of the things we try to do, but it is extremely difficult.
Yeah, indeed. You are listening, you have tuned into Conversations with Diana McCaulay, gripping, inspiring, informative, supported by the Jamaica Cultural Alliance. We'll be right back.
Traveling to Jamaica for many is more than just a trip. Jamaica is home away from home for people all over the world. It replenishes the mind, body, and spirit, from the food, music, natural environment to the vibe. The people who host our visitors are the people who live here, who work here, who are proud to call this place home. That is what makes Jamaica the heartbeat of the world. We're ever evolving, we're hopeful, ever beating, always moving forward, so that Jamaica may increase in beauty, fellowship, and prosperity, and play her part in advancing the welfare of the whole human race.
Viva el Caribe, 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 viva el Caribe. Aba we di Cancun, no aba festival, unity wakata hena, no aba festival. I am a Mexican, I'm a Jamaican, Los Dominican.
Hey guys, welcome back to this segment of Conversations with Diana McCaulay. Of course, I'm your host, Devon Harris, Jamaican bobsledder they call me. But we are supported by the Jamaica Cultural Alliance, and I'm excited to be able to spend this time with Diana in a rather, I described as really informative, inspiring conversation as well. Diana, we were, you mentioned earlier the cockpit country. And when I think of the cockpit country, I think, forgive the term, maroon country, right? That's the place where these, dare I say, badass Jamaicans kick the butts of the British redcoats, right? And it's a really proud part of our history. And I don't know that there are many Jamaicans who think about the cockpit country outside of this context, but it does play an integral role in our environment, doesn't it?
Right, yeah, and you're correct, of course, it is maroon country, but it also sits over this very large body of underground water. And a lot of people think that Jamaican freshwater comes from surface rivers, but actually over 80% of our drinking water comes from underground water. So it's a very important water resource to protect. It doesn't evaporate, it's much harder to pollute, not impossible, but much harder. So we really need to keep our underground water supplies healthy. So what happens in cockpit country? So, it's got this strange topography, these sort of hills that look like upside down egg boxes that are still forested on the hillsides. And when the rain falls, and it rains a lot in cockpit country, the rain comes down, it hits the forest, and then it's filtered down through the limestone rock into the underground water below. So there's very little surface water in cockpit country, except where it rises to the surface in various ponds, pools, risings, upwellings. And I've actually climbed down into one of the river sinks, so-called river sinks, in this higher part of the watershed. And they've done dye tracing studies that show that the water that rises there eventually ends up at a place called Dornoch Head, which is it's in the hills above Discovery Bay, and is a source of the Rio Bueno, one of our major rivers. So the concern, if there's bauxite mining in the area, it might disrupt all those processes and affect the underground water and the flow of the River Bueno, which I've heard a former Minister of Water call the almost constant and abiding river. You know, its flows don't vary very much. You know, sometimes drought affects rivers greatly, but the ones that come from underground water tend to be very stable and able to be relied upon. So that's one of the concerns. There are other concerns. There's a whole lot of biological diversity in the forests. And then there are all the rural livelihoods that often bauxite or any kind of mining affects.
Yeah, so 80% of our water comes from the cockpit country, and it provides like 40% of our underground water, correct?
80% of our fresh water overall comes from underground water sources, as opposed to, you know, the surface rivers. And 40% of that comes from cockpit country.
And if I'm correct, there are 32 rivers, streams that flow out of the cockpit country.
It's somewhere between 30 and 40. It's a little contested. So there's a list. And then there's some people who say, no, that's a tributary of that, you know, but somewhere between 30 and 40. These are not major rivers, though. There's 5 or 6 major rivers that flow from that aquifer. These are much smaller sources of water that small communities use. Yeah,
so still significant. So you mentioned the biodiversity of the cockpit country. So there's a water, talk to us about the flora, the plant life in that part of the country.
So the plant life is particularly interesting because it has high endemism, which means found there in Jamaica and nowhere else. And it's even sometimes found on one hill in cockpit country and not any other hill. Now, because the area is still so inaccessible, the studies that have been done on plants are A, not very recent, and B, only in those places that are easy to reach. So there, you know, there's lots of ferns, orchids, lots of different kinds of plants that I'm not really a plant person, that are found there and nowhere else in the world. Or birds, I think we have 28 or 29 bird species that are found here and nowhere else in the world. They're all found in cockpit country. And something that many Jamaicans don't know is Jamaica is snail heaven. So we have one of the largest sort of variety of snails in the entire world. And okay, so I can see everybody saying, oh, who cares about a snail, right? But snails are the things that eat fallen leaves. You know, they're so-called detritivores. And so they're a very important part of nutrient recycling in the natural environment. It's this incredibly complex system that we only dimly understand, that we are being reckless with, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with you that most Jamaicans will go, well, you know, why do I need to know about snails? But what we have to realize is that when you upset the apple cart, the environmental apple cart, you take one piece out, you create havoc, right? And the mongoose in Jamaica, for example, is a great example of how you take one thing out of another environment and put it in and the kind of havoc it creates. And one thing we know is that we need water and we need air, and the cockpit country does impact the air quality in Jamaica as well. Can you speak to that?
Well, essentially forests, wherever they still occur, they improve air quality because, you know, plants take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. They also, in these days of the climate crisis, which is facing the whole planet, but it will be especially hard in places like Jamaica. They also cool the temperature. And if you live anywhere in, you know, an urban area, you can immediately feel a temperature difference if places have large trees versus places that do not. And for me, that's another social justice issue, as we're talking about that. I mean, uptown Kingston is quite leafy and treed, you know, so there's a lot of trees, even though they're still taking down a lot. But it tends to be more greener than downtown Kingston, and therefore it's hotter in downtown Kingston. So what we need is this kind of sort of respect, first of all, for all these connections and complexities that we don't really understand, and understanding that these are things that affect our quality of life and are going to affect our quality of life more and more as things like the climate crisis start to take hold.
Mm. So, Diana, we've almost spanned the entire length of the island, from Kingston and, in Harborview and the sewage plant to Riverton City and, Cockpit Country, and obviously all those rural neighborhoods where we're not really taking care of the environment. Well, first of all, let me ask you about, Jamaican land we love. And because I think when you're thinking of the environment, you talk about how we relate to and with each other and the land. Can you touch on that real quick for me?
So for me, this concept of home and home place is a very important part of my own personal feelings of happiness and security. I think we all recognize when we are home. And I'm not somebody who's migrated, but I did have to spend those 2 years in the US, 2 years, which I greatly enjoyed, being in college there. But it wasn't home. It didn't smell right. It didn't taste right. It didn't feel right. I actually remember the first time I left a bar of chocolates out in the kitchen counter and nothing ate it. I couldn't believe it. That's not natural. At home, the ants would have taken out the cockroaches, everything, So I think this concept of home, this place where you belong and looks, feels, and smells and sounds right, is important to our happiness as human beings. And we have a relationship with it. And it should call from us the kind of respect that we also extend to each other. And I think if my life is now pretty long, and I think if one of the things that disturb me about life now is a sort of breakdown of that kind of respect that we have for others and for the place in which we live. We've certainly seen it over COVID, where a lot of people are only concerned about their own well-being. If they're at low risk, so you might get sick, I don't really care. And human beings are at bottom social animals. And that's part of the reason we've been so successful as a species. And I think we need to remember that we are social animals. Our success, our happiness depends on our ability to get along with others, and to understand that the place that we live has other occupants apart from human beings. So it has plants, it has animals. That's giving us this incredible range of services that we barely even notice or understand.
Yeah. What can we do? What can the average person do, especially those on the marginalized side of it, the economy, the society? I know the environmental fight is described as a middle class issue. I'm not sure how involved middle class Jamaica is in this struggle, but certainly those who are on the marginalized side are being impacted the most. What do they need to know about what they can do to make things better?
Well, first of all, I think it's changed a little bit from when I started 30 years ago, where it was very solidly middle class. I think now there's an understanding that alliances have to be formed between people of different social classes and different economic status, so sort of across the various divisions that still exist in Jamaica. And I get asked this question a lot, what can I do? And people often don't like the answer. But the number one thing that you can do is speak out. And then people look back at me and they say, but I'm not important. I don't have any connections. I don't have access to the media. I don't have access to politicians. I'm not a private sector leader. And that is to mistake the fact that all of us have connections. And we first of all have connections with the people who are closest to us. And the number one thing that changes minds is hearing something from someone you know and trust. That changes your mind much faster than information coming from a teacher, information coming from a politician, information coming from a newscaster. If somebody you know and trust is telling you something, that is when you are most likely to hear it. So it's a question of speaking first to your immediate circle of friends, and then everybody has connections. So you may not have Mr. Holness on speed dial, but maybe you know his personal assistant, maybe you know some other family person. And it means also making yourself a little unpopular when you go. My friends, sometimes when I go out with them for a drink pre-COVID, they'd say to me, do not speak. We do not want to hear you, because I know what I'm going to bring up, right? So sometimes it makes it a little bit unpopular, but that's the number one thing you can do, is to speak out. The second thing really is to inform yourself. And you might think inform yourselves first and speak out first. But I say concern is the most important thing. I don't think you need to have every answer. I often met young people who said they were unwilling to speak out because they didn't know enough. And I don't think that's the case. I think if you all you need to say is, I am concerned. I witnessed these things, or I have experienced these things, or I have read about these things, and I have concern. That is enough. It's a good enough place to start. Then you inform yourself. And then thirdly, on this sort of hierarchy, is you do what you can in your own life to minimize the impact you're having. But don't let anybody tell you that because you recycle your bottles, that is going to solve the plastic bottle problem that we have. Because the plastic bottle problem that we have is only going to be solved when we have big systemic changes, which can only be brought about by the engagement of people.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that there's a price to be paid, and part of that price is informing ourselves and being ready to use our voices, even if it means that we're going to be uncomfortable, and then to recognize that we may not necessarily have huge influencers on speed dial, as you just mentioned, but we know people, we know each other, in fact, and we all have access to technology now. We all have Instagram and Facebook and TikTok accounts that we can at least voice our opinions, or I like the word, your concerns. What's your concern? Earlier, Diana, you mentioned a book that inspired you, and I think somebody missed the name. Can you repeat that for us?
Sure. It's Summer Lightning by Olive Senior.
All right. Summer Lightning by Olive Senior. And somebody else wanted to know about how we could support you in your work to save the environment and protect the environment.
Well, I would say support the institution. So support the Jamaica Environment Trust, which, although I retired from there, there's a new CEO, and they're a non-governmental organization, a charity, who is doing the same important work. So, find an institution that's working in the environmental sector and support them financially if you can. If not, you can join them. A lot of them are membership organizations. And they rely to, how I said about speak out? They rely too on when they post, let us say, a concern, a story about the country. They also want people to like the story or to put their comments, so that policymakers can see that there is concern for these issues. So it's again something that people don't necessarily think is very exciting, but it's a very important way to support the people doing this work. This conversation that we're having here, Devon and I too want to thank the Jamaica Cultural Alliance, is part of how you reach out to people and maybe they begin to feel concerns and they start to pass those concerns on. This is the most important thing that we can offer.
Yeah, indeed. Offer voice your concerns. So I know you got started on this journey in part because you saw how some of the places that you enjoyed as a child were disappearing, and then there were just other places that you had never been to, like Riverton City, for example. How has your, I guess, love for the work that you do with the environment changed over the years, if it has?
So I think in the early days, it was rather uninformed. It was an emotional connection, something I didn't think much about. And now it has this second aspect to it, which is all the information I've learned over the years, all the learning that I've done, many battles that I lost. So it's a little bit much more bittersweet and complex at this stage of my life. And I often have to deal with feelings of despair, because it does sometimes seem to me that we really still haven't understood that we are actually destroying our one and only home. And on those days, I have feelings of failure and despair. But then there are other days when I meet young people, especially, who will tell me that I came to their school, 12 years ago and caused them to go and do a natural science degree up at UWI. I have those kinds of interactions as well. That it's a bit like book writing. You don't know what you do. You're not exactly sure who it reaches, who it touches, whose life it changes. You just send these ripples out into the world, and you hope that they find a good shore to land on.
Yeah, so you just mentioned the youth and the fact that some of them have come to you and to say how much you have inspired, I guess, their career choices. Do you find that there is generally speaking, should I say a groundswell or an active interest by young people in the environment and the kind of work that you're doing?
So there's interest, there's a lot of interest, but I'd like to see more militancy, because young people are the ones who are going to have to pay the price for what we do. So JET has had a schools environment program since 1997. So we've had a very strong education program in schools. And we used to have a program for sixth formers called the Student Environment Network, which was for years. It was, a very vibrant program. They had about 4 different youth conferences. They took politicians on tours of Kingston Harbor. So we've always had a strong focus on youth and have had different projects over the 30 years. And now there's a whole new set of young people who are involved. But I guess I think, now I've sort of coached with this elder title, that there needs to be a bit more militancy from the young people, because the hour is late and the matter is urgent.
Yes, the hour is late and the matter is definitely urgent. I agree. You received the Norman Manley Award recently, Diana. Tell us about that. What is the Norman Manley Award?
So it's an award from excellence from the Norman Washington Manley Foundation. And, I was told about it standing under the lignum-vitae tree in my car park, because it was kind of in the middle of COVID, with a man, Ainsley Henriquez, their chairman, standing 8 feet away. It was a surreal experience, because I never expected that kind of recognition at all. So that's what it is for somebody who it's for a lifetime, a sort of lifetime achievement award. It's not for somebody who's just done something. So, and then I had to make an address, and I had to sit down and think about and write about what really the last 30 years have meant for me. And I tried to do that in a speech that is online if you want to go and look at it.
Well, the last 30 years, your last 30 years has meant a lot to us. And again, I want to reiterate that from a grateful nation. I mean, I think you have set us, at least started the journey, in my opinion, that is hopefully going to inspire our younger Jamaicans to become more militant, as you say, and to, in America, they say if you're a Jamaican, you have to have multiple jobs, and you're proving that right. So talk to us about your books and your writing.
So my last book is Daylight Come, and although I'm very horrible at book promotion, this is what it looks like, and of course that's upside down and gray on white. And this is a climate change book. This is my most overtly environmental book. And it's about a situation, it's set in 2084, where it's become too hot to go outside during the day. And so you can't go out in the day. So life has changed around. People sleep in the day and work at night. And there's a teenage girl who lives in what is loosely disguised Kingston who can't sleep. And she convinces her mother to leave the city for higher altitudes up in the mountains, to see if it can be cooler, and if she can find people of her own age that she can live in a more normal way. So that's the last published book. I hope people read. It's an adventure story, just because I love reading adventure stories, and I hope people can read it. And I say in the author's note that I hope this remains in the category of speculative fiction, that in fact these things that I describe don't come to pass. Although I will say that everything that I put in Daylight Come is something that has happened somewhere in the world already. The book I'm working on is called Roots of Stone, and it's about a 99-year-old rural Jamaican woman at the end of her life. And the stones that her house is built of have started speaking to her. And they have a message for her. She has to do something before she dies.
Mm, mm. Well, we're looking forward to that and all the other writings that you have to offer us, to include maybe some of those that's in the box, who
Maybe.
from a reread and a rewrite one or two times might just create the next classic. But wow, what a treat to be able to spend some time with you, Diana. Thank you for all that you do. It is amazing work. And, I've learned a lot. I didn't even know about the snails up in the cockpit country. So thank you for that. Thank you for the work. Jamaica is a better for the work from that woman. Keeping that spine of steel as you continue. Thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me.
Friends, this has been a conversation with Diana McCaulay. Of course, I'm Devon Harris, and we are supported by the Jamaica Cultural Alliance. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Viva el Caribe, 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 viva el Caribe. Abawidi Cancun, no Abba Festival, Unity Cartagena, no Abba Festival. I am a Mexican, I'm a Jamaican, Los Dominican.
Jamaica.
Best decision ever.
Feel the sand between your toes and the gentle waves of the sea on your skin. Feel the warm Jamaican breeze lift your spirits and nourish your soul. Escape to exactly what makes your heart beat. You will love every moment. Jamaica, heartbeat of the world. Let's go.